Hi, everybody. Welcome to another of Moonee Valley Libraries or online author talks. My name's Steve, and I work for Moonee Valley Libraries. Tonight, we have leading Australian historian David Day talking about his latest novel, Maurice Blackburn, Champion of the People. I would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge on behalf of Moonee Valley City Council the traditional custodians of the land that I'm broadcasting from, the Wurrundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, their spirits, ancestors, elders, and community members past and present. Moonee Valley is proud of its diverse community and acknowledges the contributions that all people make to this vibrant and inclusive municipality. So before David begins, I'd love to give you a little bit of background on him. So David is a best-selling biographer and historian. He's written widely on Australian history and his early focus was on Second World War and the relationships between Australia and the United Kingdom. He's also written on the careers of prime ministers, including John Curtin, Ben Chifley, Andrew Fisher, and Paul Keating. He's been a visiting fellow at Clare College in Cambridge and a visiting fellow at the University of Aberdeen and ANU. He's currently an honorary associate in the history program at La Trobe University. His latest book tells the story of Maurice Blackburn, an influential politician who was Labor member for the electorate of Essendon during the First World War. So please welcome David Day.
Thank you. Well, Maurice Blackburn, this was something that came out of left field at me when I was immersed in researching and starting to write a biography of Bob Hawke. And the firm, Maurice Blackburn, got in touch and told me that they were about to celebrate their centenary. And they were really keen to get a biography of their founder, Maurice Blackburn, the lawyer, politician, and civil libertarian. And I'd sort of known or come across Maurice when I was writing my biography of Bob Hawke. And sort of was intrigued by him, this man of principle who'd, of John Curtin, and he stood up against Curtin during the Second World War. He'd opposed conscription along with Curtin in the First World War, but unlike Curtin, had then opposed conscription for overseas service. And Maurice always made a distinction between overseas service and conscription for the defence of Australia. He was fine with that, fine with calling people up to be conscripted to defend Australia, but not to be sent overseas to fight in what he saw as an imperial war. So he sort of intrigued me, and it took me a while, though, a few weeks before I decided that I really could put Hawke aside for a bit and take up Maurice Blackburn and try and explore his life. It was made clear right from the beginning that it wasn't meant to be, even though it was celebrating the centenary of the firm, it wasn't meant to be a history of the firm. It was meant to be a biography of the founder. And of course, Maurice had a very prominent and very political wife as well, Doris Blackburn, who later held the seat of Burke that Maurice had vacated with his death. But it wasn't either going to be a history or a biography of the Blackburns, because that was already being done and done very well by Caroline Rasmussen. So this was just going to be coming to terms with the making of Maurice Blackburn. And my approach to biography is very much to look at the childhood and, you know, going back to the origins of the parents as well, because you can't understand the adult without also understanding in quite some detail their childhood and what their parents, how their parents influenced their upbringing. So I had a great time driving all around Victoria from Gippsland right up through the goldfields, looking at where Maurice was born at Inglewood in central Victoria, and looking at all the old newspapers from Inglewood, at the activities of his father in particular, who'd come from a sort of both his parents really were part of what could be considered the colonial gentry, even though his father was descended from a convict. It was a convict who'd been a sort of a well-to-do London person who'd then defrauded his employer and been sent out, and then became very successful in Tasmania and then in Victoria, designing buildings, bridges, and churches, before dying tragically of typhoid in Melbourne, and was buried in the church that he designed in Fitzroy. Then his mother was from the McRae family, and which was very much, part of the Melbourne gentry of the time, was always on the calling cards for events at Government House. And you can go down and see the McRae homestead down on the Mornington Peninsula. But they both, they weren't particularly wealthy, and his father was a bank manager in Inglewood, but very much a power in the town. And it was said that he was involved with about 50 organisations, voluntary organisations in the town. And he was a man that was said to be someone who speaks his mind. He was involved with the Australian Natives Association, very much involved in developing this idea of a new Australian nation and what it should be like. He also seemed to be anti-war. He seems to have been opposed to the Sudan expedition in 1885. Maurice could have had quite a secure childhood had his father not been transferred to a different bank in Avoca, a bit further south from Inglewood, again in central Victoria. And unfortunately, Avoca didn't have a very good water supply. And the great irony, I guess, of Maurice's life is his grandfather had died of typhoid in Fitzroy, and now his father was in a town that had terrible water supply, and where typhoid took hold of the town and was taking a great swathe of people from the town, including Maurice's father. So at the age of 6, his father dies of typhoid, and his mother is left a widow with 4 young children. Fortunately, she was, fairly well connected from as I said, the colonial gentry, and so returns to Melbourne, and with the help of relatives and with her own means, because she'd inherited some money and some assets, so she was able to set up house in Melbourne, and through relatives was able to send Maurice to good schools in Toorak and then to Melbourne Grammar. His mother always had great ideas for him. A lot of responsibility was put on his shoulder, being the sort of man of the family at the age of 6 onwards. And so she expected a lot from him. And then just as he's getting to the stage when he can establish himself, after graduating from Melbourne Grammar and going on to Melbourne University to start a law course, tragedy strikes again when his younger brother is diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. And Maurice has the terrible task of having to take his brother down to the Kew Asylum and having committed to their care. So it meant even more responsibility now devolved onto Maurice's shoulders to fulfill the expectations of his mother, but also to help provide income as well. At the time, coming from that sort of gentrified background, he had a brief flirtation with conservative politics in South Yarra before he joined the Socialist Party. So this is the early 20th century, a time of great turmoil in Australia, a time of great hope after the depression of the 1890s and then the drought. Australia is emerging from these things. It's joining together into one nation, and there's great hope for what Australia can become. And you've got social reformers coming from around the world to look at what Australia was doing in terms of votes for women, in terms of social welfare legislation, etc. And particularly when we had a majority Labor government, the first majority Labor government in the world in Australia under Andrew Fisher. So Morris then is getting involved with the Victorian Socialist Party, which is sort of a ginger group really within the Labor Party. Many people had memberships in both. And it saw itself as, I guess, a purer version of the Labor Party and one that was trying to keep the Labor Party on a socialist track. He fell foul, though, of his fellow members in the Socialist Party, ironically on this issue of conscription, which would dog him all his life. And he was, even from this early stage and throughout his life, a man of great principle. And looking rationally, he could see real reasons for wanting to have a militia to be able, he saw that as being egalitarian and democratic. It was the idea that came from America, that if you had a conscripted militia to defend your own country. But he was opposed, as I mentioned before, to overseas service. And he fell out with his fellow members of the Socialist Party, people like Curtin, who were against militarism, who were against war at all costs. So they didn't want conscription either for the local defence of Australia or for overseas service. So he then tended to move more and more towards the Labor Party. He became involved with his future wife, Doris, who came from the well-to-do Horden family, who sort of the Sydney equivalent to the Myers. And she'd grown up in Balwyn, lived in a grand house, and had a certain amount of money to her name. So they were both then descended from gentry and now were part really of the new Australian gentry in a way. Morris, though, became more and more, as I said, involved with the Labor Party and stood for Parliament for the seat of Essendon on the eve of the First World War. And he initially supported the war. He thought that Britain was doing the right thing by standing up to German militarism. But then after Gallipoli, when there was a great recruiting drive set up by the Victorian government, he stood in his seat in the Victorian Parliament and announced that he would have nothing to do with recruiting people to war. He wouldn't try and encourage people to do what he wasn't prepared to do. And he also wasn't going to be involved in getting workers to give their lives to a war that capitalists, that owners of property weren't prepared to give their property towards. So this caused a great furor at the time. He was criticised in the Parliament, in the press. He announced at one stage that the workers of Victoria or of Australia wouldn't be any worse off if the Germans invaded Australia and they were ruled by German capitalism rather than by British capitalism. So he was derided by his Conservative opponents as being Prince Maurice of Wurrung for not being worse off. So this caused him great problems in holding on to his seat, which was made worse when he came out and was one of the leaders in the anti-conscription movement in 1916 and again in 1917, speaking widely and speaking, going around Australia as well. And he was blamed or credited with helping to swing the vote against conscription during those referenda by the speaking that he did, particularly in South Australia, in helping us to swing the vote in that state against conscription. So the bitterness of all this, though, when everything was about loyalty to Britain, loyalty to Australia, loyalty to the empire, caused him to lose his seat, unfortunately, in 1917, and to be thrown out of Parliament. It also caused him to lose a lot of work because he was also working as a barrister, and had to be referred, work had to be referred to you by a solicitor, and the solicitors weren't sending him work because they feared that the judges would look darkly upon him, would look darkly upon his arguments, and he wouldn't be able to win cases for their clients. So work tended to dry up. So it was in that context in 1919 that he set up a firm of his own called Maurice Blackburn, which was a firm of solicitors that could take on work, and took on work mainly for the downtrodden, but also for trade unions, doing work on behalf of their members, particularly things like workers' compensation work. So he could be referred work as a barrister through his own firm, and established the principles of the firm, that it was, as they continue to advertise, they fight for fair. And they did that right from the beginning. And that sort of ethos that Maurice infused in the firm right from the beginning still exists today. So Maurice, though, wasn't put off by this, wasn't put off by the bitterness, wasn't put off by the hardships, the economic hardships and the snubbing that went on during these years against him. And he wouldn't be silenced in speaking out against the war, in speaking for a negotiated peace at the end of the war. He didn't want a harsh peace imposed upon Germany because he very wisely and presciently saw that a harsh peace imposed upon Germany would simply sow the seeds for another war, which of course it did. But the harsh peace was imposed largely by, or certainly with the eager encouragement of our own Billy Hughes. So he's having both a life in politics, even though he's out of Parliament now. He continued to be very active in the Victorian ALP, was president of the Labor Party in Victoria, and was involved in sort of steering the ALP in a way that could see it come back into power both federally and in state governments. At the time, it was sort of divided between people who wanted a very radical Labor Party, a Labor Party that would almost be revolutionary. This was, in the wake of the Russian Revolution. And Maurice, of course, was very anti-violence and was not, the idea of having a revolutionary party was absolute anathema to him. So he was instrumental in at the 1921 Labor Party conference in having what was called, or what came to be known as, the Blackburn Declaration adopted, which turned the Labor Party away from that radical socialist orientation that many people, including John Curtin, favoured at the time, and in favour of a policy that recognised the place of private property in the Australian economy, and it made the Labor Party electable. And this declaration lasted, in these terms, lasted right up into the 1950s. It was in the mid-1920s, though, that he managed to get himself back into Parliament, into the Victorian Parliament, and this time he was not only principled, he was incredibly courageous, because what he did was take on the might of the John Wren machine, the Wren who ran the Sly Grog, the betting shops, and had thugs running around with revolvers in the inner cities. And Maurice took this machine on and stood for the seat of Fitzroy, and despite incredible pressure and threats and intimidation, won the seat handily. This was the time, of course, when people were candidates had to speak on street corners and had to be protected by people of their own. He would have sympathetic unionists protecting him from Wren's thugs. So Morris found his way back into Parliament, and that incredible contest that he had at the time was later immortalised by Frank Hardy in Power Without Glory, where Morris appears under a pseudonym. Well, he was admired despite getting back in, despite being president of the Labor Party. He never became a minister in the Victorian government, even once Labor got back into power. He was close to becoming a minister, but he wasn't the sort of guy who would go and collect the votes. He wouldn't go and organise on his own behalf. He expected to be recognised for his worth and for people to come to him and give their votes to him. And if he was standing against someone, as he once was, and in one particular case, an elderly MP who'd served his time, Morris stepped down in his favour, recognising the contribution that this particular person had made to the Labor Party, rather than trying to take the position from him. He did, though, in the mid-30s, become elected as Speaker of the Victorian Parliament. He stood and was voted in by both sides of Parliament. He was widely recognised as a man of great education, of great fairness, of great learning. He was always having a great... If you look at photos of the Parliament, he's the one with a pile of books in front of his desk, or on his desk in front of him. And his daughter talked of him walking off to Parliament in the morning from his house with books under his arm and holding a book up in front of his face, and reading as he walked along from his home in Essendon into the centre of Melbourne. He wasn't in the speakership for very long, though. He very quickly moved across to the federal Parliament and stood for the seat of Burke, and again was confronted by the Wren machine, but overcame it. He also saw off an attempt by John Curtin to transfer across from Perth to take that seat of Burke when his old mentor Frank Anstey resigned. So Morris now had the seat of Burke, which was a very safe Labor seat that he held right up until 1946. Sorry, 43. I must get this right. 1943. So he held the seat of Burke, and this was during the Depression, and Morris, being a great fighter for the downtrodden, threw in his lot with Jack Lang, the New South Wales Premier, who opposed the Premier's plan and wanted the burden of the Depression shared equally, and particularly by the British bondholders, rather than by Australian pensioners and Australian wage earners, who were being forced to take salary cuts and cuts in pensions, and also, of course, being thrown out of work. So Morris saw that that the Labor Party was compromising itself by supporting the Premier's plan, that the Scullin government and the Victorian government were compromising themselves and disadvantaging their supporters by supporting the Premier's plan that had been imposed basically by the Bank of England and the British bondholders. Well, that didn't earn him many friends, particularly when he went to Sydney and stood on the platform with Jack Lang when Jack Lang was standing for Parliament in his seat, and was opposed by the Federal Labor organisation in the person of Ben Chifley. So Ben Chifley bravely stood against Jack Lang in his seat, even though he had little chance of winning it. And it was wouldn't have earned him many friends in the Federal Labor Party when Morris went and stood on the platform with Jack Lang. Particularly wouldn't have endeared him to Ben Chifley, who had a very lonely time in the late 1930s trying to fly the federal flag in New South Wales. So once in Canberra, though, his education, his principles, his value, his popularity was widely regarded, and he was certainly seen by journalists and by some of his fellow MPs as a possible successor to Jim Scullin. So he could have been the Labor leader to follow Scullin, and then the leader to follow Menzies and lead Australia during the Second World War. But it was not to be. It was not to be. He may well have got the required number of votes, but at the time, Labor was split between the pro-Lang and anti-Lang forces, so there were very few people in the Federal Labor Party, and the pro-Lang people had not yet rejoined the Labor Party. Had they rejoined, which happened only a short time later, Morris may well have got sufficient support to become the leader. Fortunately, I guess for him and for the Labor Party, he didn't become the leader, because it really needed somebody who was able to compromise. And Morris, when his principles were involved, wasn't able or willing to compromise those principles. He had the distinction during this time, during the late 30s and in 1942, of being twice expelled from the Labor Party, which I'm not sure if anyone else has ever been twice expelled from the Labor Party. But he was expelled for speaking on a platform with the Council Against War and Fascism in direct contravention of the state executive instruction, and then later for speaking on a platform for the Australian-Soviet Friendship League during the Second World War, ironically after Australia had become allied with the Soviet Union. And in the second case, in 1942, he didn't attempt to rejoin. So he became an independent MP for Burke, and then in 1943, partly as a result of John Curtin's efforts, he lost his seat at the 1943 election. Curtin appealed to people to only vote for official Labor candidates and to throw out any independent Labor candidates. So Morris lost his seat, and just months later was stricken with a brain tumour that had been slowly developing and killed him in early 1944. At his graveside, there was a huge and varied crowd that really was a testament to his life and to the man that he'd been. Much of the cabinet, of Curtin's cabinet, came down specially from Canberra for the funeral. One of the people that was prominent by their absence was Ben Chifley. And being the humble man that he was, Morris was buried. It took an incredible time for us to find his grave, in fact, because he was buried in his wife's family grave with just a tiny notation on a general memorial attached to this large family grave. So summing up then, he was a man of principle, who was very much his father's son and his mother's son, who stood up for the oppressed, and the downtrodden. And he embraced, at the time, Australia's growing ethnic diversity. And he was involved with Southern European groups in Melbourne. He used to go along to the German club until they displayed a photo of Hitler at the doorway, and then he never went again. But he used to embrace all these non-British aspects of Australian society, and also the Chinese Australians at the time. So one of his biggest legacies, though, unfortunately, he's been largely written out of Australian politics. Hopefully, Carolyn's book and my own will help to redress that. But one of the biggest legacies that has endured is of course, the law firm that still bears his name and still follows that ethos that he imbued it with back in 1919. So it was a great joy to write the book. It was a great education for me. I hadn't really realised how close he'd come to becoming Labor leader, and really seeing Morris in all his aspects, as an anti-war activist, as a prominent Labor leader, as a civil libertarian, and just a terribly decent person, about which there were no skeletons in his closet, which was very reassuring, because usually there are skeletons when you dig far enough. So I'll leave it there then, I think, and open it up to questions. I must say this is a very historic talk. It's the only talk I've ever given in my slippers.
Thank you so much, David. I'm currently in my socks, so I took my shoes off when I got in at the door, and it's a weird way to work, but I think it's something that I've gotten used to, and going back into work has been, I have to wear like proper pants and everything again. It's just been very, 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 very weird. So a few questions have started to come in. So if you would like to ask a question for David, just remember the Q&A section down the bottom of Zoom. If you need to move your mouse, or if you're on a phone, and you can just type a question in there and we'll ask them. So the first question, David, is what do you think was the turning point that caused Morris to turn away from flirting with conservatism to becoming a socialist?
I think it was possibly the 1890s Depression, when he was working for a law firm run by Theodore Fink, who was very well named. He was a very powerful man, very rich man in Melbourne, and his brother was even richer, I think. But Fink made a specialty of getting people out of bankruptcy, and while retaining, getting them away from their creditors, while retaining their wealth. So using all sorts of dodgy means. I think that was a bit of an eye-opener for Morris. And I think possibly, his brother's illness, seeing that side of life, and the difficulties, Kew Asylum, it's a grand building, and it's become very upmarket apartments now, but it was a terrible, terrible place at the time. That would have been, I think, after a while, he kept that secret through his life. I don't think his family were aware of it. I'm not sure that his wife was aware of it, because there was great shame involved, of course, in having mental illness in the family at that stage. I think that was also a turning point in his ideas as well.
Wonderful. So the next question is asking, can you talk a bit more about Morris's anti-fascist activities and his support for Republican Spain?
Yeah, he was very worried. He'd warned that this was going to happen by imposing a harsh peace upon Germany, and now it was happening, and he saw the world sliding towards war. So he was very much against that, and he helped host the anti-Nazi journalist Egon Kisch, when he came to Australia and famously had to jump off his ship and break his leg in order to be able to stay in Australia. And Morris, I think he just took umbrage whenever anybody tried to tell him what to do. He would say, well, why? Why? And at the time, of course, the Labor Party had gone from being quite left-wing in the pre-1920s, and then during the 20s, and then gradually in the 30s became controlled by the right wing. And Morris was still very popular in the Labor Party, but was increasingly on the outer. And he just took great umbrage when the Victorian State Executive instructed that people were not to be involved in the Council Against War and Fascism, because it was a broad-based organisation. It involved churches, it involved some members of the Communist Party. So it was seen as being a united front, as being a sort of a stalking horse by these Labor Party executives, seen as being a stalking horse for the Communist Party, and that Labor Party people shouldn't be involved with it. And the Labor Party tried to set up its own organisation, which was never a starter, really. And Morris said, these issues are too important. These issues are too important. I have to speak out. And other Labor Party MPs did as well, but it was only Morris. It was only Morris who was penalised and excluded from the party for his activity.
Yeah, it's just reading through. It was just like completely interesting time. You just kind of looked in shock and you're like, oh. So the next question would be, so what would Morris think of modern Australian society? After having looked at him, what would you think he would be thinking about?
He would have great trouble recognising it, really. The homelessness, the poverty, the fact that it's taken the Labor Party so long to get off its bum and set up a social welfare, social housing program, which even then only handles a quarter of the need. He would be appalled by that. He would be appalled by the treatment of refugees. He would be absolutely appalled. But what he would embrace, though, with great joy, is Australian diversity. That was something that he was against white Australia. He was always embracing diversity at the time. And we think diversity started happening in 1945 with the mass immigration, but Melbourne was a very diverse place. Even prior to Federation, of course, we had our Chinatown precedes Federation, and the continental cafes and all sorts of things were going on in Melbourne. It was a really lively place. It only really deadened in the 1940s and perhaps the early 50s, perhaps, before it really took off and became. And I think, unfortunately, one of the reasons it became dead was an initiative of Morris in bringing in 6 o'clock closing, which was his initiative in the First World War, which helped to really kill nightlife in Melbourne. So I guess he'd probably welcome that 6 o'clock closing going. Yeah. So there'd be many aspects of Australia that he would welcome, but he would be very loud in denouncing our treatment of refugees, our treatment of our Indigenous people, and our increasing inequality. Yeah.
So what did the firm Maurice Blackburn think of the book?
I think they welcomed it. They certainly put on a very good launch. But there's still much to say, of course. It's a fairly slim book. Even with Caroline's book and mine, there'd be a great book. There are several great books still to be written about him. A book just about his civil libertarian side in the 30s and 40s would be worth writing, I would think. A book about the firm itself. There hasn't been a history of the firm written. That deserves to be written.
You're not willing to take it up yourself?
I've got lots of other things to write, unfortunately. But somebody, a lawyer, that's a job for a lawyer, I think.
So a question is, what do you do when you're researching somebody for a book and you uncover something less than flattering about them? Do you put it in or do you leave it out?
It depends. I mean, sometimes I leave it out, and it really depends. I mean, there was some things are just puzzling that you can't sort of say the last word on it. I mean, there was a really interesting photograph that I found which I've written about, but I didn't put in the book, in the biography of Andrew Fisher. There was a photograph. I'd gone through all his papers and was going through photographs that he had because he was an amateur photographer. He had a mansion in St Kilda and a dark room in the basement. And there was just this little photograph of a naked man on a yacht. And there was no context. There was nothing. You couldn't tell who it was. And there was nothing I could make of it. So I left it out. In other occasions where it might cause unnecessary hurt, I've left things out, or where I can't be confident that it actually happened. But even so, I find to my pain that sometimes you can't help causing pain to the people or relatives or friends of the people you've written about. You sort of do it and the book comes out and they go, whoa, and sometimes give me a bit of a hard time.
I suppose you were talking before about skeletons in the closet, and suppose not everybody even knows those. So,
yes. So it was. I guess the skeleton in Morris's closet was his brother James, the mental illness that he kept secret, and he obviously felt shameful about, I think, and never wrote about. Sort of alluded to it maybe in a speech in the Victorian Parliament, but never directly spoke of it. And they covered up. His brother died very young, and so the reason for his death was covered up. It was said to be, I think it was an infection of some type.
What? Another question has come in. As it says, what do you think Morris's view of the Soviet Union was?
Well, the reason why he was in the Australian-Soviet Friendship League was he realised that Australian safety and the Allied safety, if we were going to win the war against Italy, Japan, and Germany, it could only be done with the assistance of the Soviet Union. So it was, there were people who were arguing that Britain actually had to ally itself with Germany, that the Soviet Union was actually the main enemy confronting the world, and that there should be an alliance between Germany and Britain against the Soviet Union. Well, this was something that Morris abhorred. Initially, of course, after the Russian Revolution, he had been a supporter of it, but he didn't want a revolution in Australia. He saw that a revolution was necessary and the right thing to happen in Russia in 1917. But it wasn't something that he would have welcomed in Australia. But the reason why he supported the Soviet Union in the late 1930s and in in 1942 was because he saw that the Soviet Union was necessary for the safety of Australia.
Yeah. Especially after reading, especially about what the fall of Singapore and all of the decisions around that, I can completely understand why. Yeah.
Yes, Curtin did as well when he was Prime Minister. He appealed to the Soviet Union to basically declare war against Japan in order to distract the Japanese from Australia.
So recently, a question's coming. So recently, we've seen in the US talks about socialist things in their politics there, and Morris being a socialist here in Australia at that time. Is the socialism that, of course, he would for, is that idea of the socialist world that he had long gone? Sorry, that question is a bit weird. Is the socialist world that Morris campaigned for long gone, and is what is there today completely different?
Yes, I'm not sure what he would be campaigning for today. His views kept changing. He sort of dallied with the idea of guild socialism, which was about workers controlling their factories. It was a sort of a short-lived British idea that sort of died out in the 1920s. And more he was involved with action on civil liberties, standing up for representing people who were defying conscription in the Second World War. So he would represent the Quakers, he would represent the Seventh-day Adventists, he would argue against the National Security Act. So that's what he would be involved in today. He would be out on the platform. He would be in front of the cameras today, arguing against the national security legislation that has been rammed through Parliament over the last 10 years or so in order to protect us, but can just as easily be turned against us.
So then the follow-up is, will we ever see someone like Morris in Parliament again?
Well, I think there are people in Parliament like Morris. I guess there's less of them, perhaps, and there has been a tendency with 20-something-year-old apparatchiks controlling what MPs say, so that in the old days, I'm talking 70s and 80s, you would get MPs coming out giving their ideas on all sorts of policies. Now they're just not allowed to do it, and hence the big furor with Joel Fitzgibbon, because he wants to speak out, and it's unusual now for an MP to speak out. Whereas I think we should welcome it. We shouldn't welcome Fitzgibbon defending coal mining. But we should welcome MPs speaking out. It becomes a much more vibrant democracy, I think. And they've tended to be very meek, which I don't think does anyone any favours, least of all them.
No, and it's refreshing to see. So,
yeah,
like I even though what he was saying might not be good, but it's refreshing to see someone actually speaking out and having an opinion.
Yes, yeah.
So,
rather than just speaking to talking points.
Yes.
So they're delivered to them by email that morning, and everyone comes out with the same talking point.
Yeah.
Which just lowers the regard of people for politicians.
Yeah, completely. So another question has come through. Can you talk about the source material you used?
The Maurice Blackburn has quite an extensive collection of papers in the State Library. As I mentioned, I went around Victoria. I went to the school that he taught in Gippsland, in Sale in Gippsland. I went to the house where he was born, and stood in the room where he was probably born, and the house where his father died in Avoca. So it's a matter of, and tramped through a lot of cemeteries looking at the headstone of his father's, and which actually looking for it rather, I could never find it. And finding a lot on the internet. I mean, I would have been lost without Trove, without the National Library's Trove, and just the internet generally. It's great to be able to, when you're in the middle of something and a question arises, just to jump on the computer and search for it on the internet and have the answer in a way that was simply not possible even 20 years ago. Getting whole books that are long out of print and very difficult to find, but are nevertheless available on the internet. So it's a mixture of doing all those things, of walking the places that he'd been, of going to all the places, standing outside, sometimes going inside the houses where he lived, and of trawling my way through his collection of papers and the collections of various other people.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. So did Morris have much of an interaction with or influence on Essendon?
Yeah, I mean, he shifted, of course, from Essendon. He was there for quite a while. It was a very divided electorate. It was half of it was middle class, and it extended across into quite a working class area. And he was very popular in the electorate, except in that period in 1917 when he was decried as a supporter of the Germans. So he had a hard time then, but I think people always respected him as a person of principle. So whereas other people, there was a trade unionist who was once assaulted in his office and tarred and feathered.
Whoa.
And others were, beaten up in the street. That never happened to Morris. I think he was always respected by his supporters and his opponents in that way.
Wonderful. Thank you. So another question that's popped in is, what's your next project?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm writing a biography of Bob Hawke at the moment, which is it's a cupboard full of skeletons.
And how are you finding what to keep in and what to take out with that one? You just
Well, I'm still in the process, so
yeah,
it's been a great journey that's still ongoing, and made much more difficult because of COVID, of course.
Yes.
You can only do so much on the internet. You really do have to get out, go interstate. You've got to see people.
Yeah.
Talk to people on the phone, but it's really good to look people in the eye when you're talking to them.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, so another question is, what's been your best find while researching a book?
Morris?
Oh, no, in general.
Any book. I don't know. I think it's, the concentration on childhood. I think it just seems such a no-brainer. But it's something, if you get a dozen Australian political biographies in front of you and leaf through them, you'll find that most biographers tend to rush through the childhood. There might be a chapter, usually be a chapter, and occasionally you'll get 2 chapters. But by that time they'll be in their 20s probably. Whereas I might spend 5 chapters exploring their parents and their childhood in quite some detail, insofar as it can be recovered. I've certainly been doing that with Hawke.
Yeah.
I went to New Zealand to see and walk the streets where his parents had lived and worked and preached. Hawke wasn't yet born, but it seemed to me important to do that And it was a really, really rich trove of material came out of that experience.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. So another question I've got in is that so it was interesting discovering this book that socialism was adopted by a lot of the children of the gentry. Do you believe there was a reason for this?
Yeah, there was a sort of a middle classness about it, particularly with the Victorian Socialist Party. I mean, it was a mixture of people, but there were a fair swag of middle class people, and the Victorian Socialist Party itself wasn't sort of it had people speaking on street corners and selling their newspapers on street corners, but it was also sort of almost akin to a church. It had a Sunday school, it had choirs, and because you weren't allowed to have political meetings on a Sunday, they would combine it with entertainment. So they would take over theatres in the city, which weren't allowed to put on musicals or plays or whatever, and they would take over those theatres and put on the socialist orchestra and some singing, and then they would have a speech, either by somebody like Maurice Blackburn or John Curtin or one of the other visiting socialists or people from the Women's Political Association. So it was a really lively time.
Oh, wonderful. So another question, and this is probably our last question. As a biographer, has there been another writer that has been an influence on you?
I'm not sure. I mean, there are other biographers that I really admire. I really admired David Marr's biography of Patrick White. That sort of blew me away. And there are many other, biographers and other writers that I admire, but I've never felt that I follow in their footsteps as such, not consciously anyway. I just sort of admire them from afar, I guess, and go my own way. try to go my own way, and write a book. I mean, I wrote a book with a reader in mind, very much having a reader in mind, but also just for my own pleasure, to come to grips with a person, to try and feel as if I've got inside their head. And that's probably very presumptuous of me, because I don't think you really can. But you've got to try. And that's what I'm always attempting to do.
Wonderful. It comes certainly as someone who has read a few. It definitely comes across. So, but David, thank you so much. That's all that we have tonight. All the time we have for tonight, unfortunately. So, on behalf of everyone tonight, I would like to thank you for your insights into your writing. And I'd like to also thank everybody for attending tonight. I'd also like to thank Kelvin for handling the technical side tonight and for keeping us on the air. Normally, we're very much in the swapped positions, so it's been interesting to be on this side of the Zoom, if I will say. We hope to see you again at another one of our Zoom events. Good night and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.